season starts here, the Vancouver Boat Show.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us at the VIBS. So, if you experience any technical difficulties during the seminar, please contact me, your moderator, Bobby, in the chat window, and I'll help you with anything that can be helped from my side. During the seminar, you might come up with questions or comments. Please share them in the Q&A window. You can access it by clicking the Q&A button. At the end of the presentation, we'll be reading out the questions and finding some answers. So that gets us into a good shape to get started. So it's our pleasure now to present Electrifying, an electric boats and motors primer by Jeff Butler.
Thank you, Bobby. My name, yes, is Jeff Butler, as you can see on the screen there. I'm the editor-publisher of an international website journal called Plug Boats. Before we get started, I'll just give you a quick couple of minutes on how all that started and how it's going. I was doing a blog about solar energy, and when I was doing that blog about solar energy, I came across a solar boat race in Monaco, and I thought, wouldn't that be a fantastic thing to have here in Canada? I live in Toronto, and I don't know if you've ever been there, but there's a harbor where a lot of people go by the waterfront, and I thought it'd be a great place for a solar boat race. In trying to put that together, you have to put together teams from universities and things and get boats built. And I needed various things like floating docks. And so I went to the Toronto Boat Show. This is just over 2 years ago, and talked to people there about, how they could help and things. And they were quite intrigued. Even the people that were deeply involved in fossil fuel boats and fossil fuel motors said, something's going to happen with those electric boats one day. And so I literally went home that night, and because I knew something about doing blogs and websites, I said, I'm going to start a website about electric boats. So that was February 2nd, 2019. And I've now had 925,000 views of the website. And for this year, I'd probably be 1 million views this year. So the growth in electric boats is tremendous so far, and I think that it's just beginning. As kind of witnessed by here, you are asking about it. There's a lot of intrigue about it. So the one thing I want to say before we go too much further is it's an electric boats and motors primer. So I am not an engineer. I'm not a physicist. I'm not a mechanical guy at all. I'm actually a writer. And so when I started Plug Boats, I knew very, very little about electric boats. And so that's kind of the way I've gone into this electric boats and motors primer, is to make it as simple as I can for you. I'll get into, it's fairly detailed, but it's not going to be like computations about whether you should have this battery at that many kilowatts versus this or that. It's to give you an idea of how it all works. Because the thing that I found in doing these talks also is that people have varying degrees of knowledge about electric boats and about boats in general. So if you find some of it pretty basic, just hang in there and hopefully we'll get to something that you find interesting. So let's get going. When I say electric boats or electric boat motors, you probably think of that. That's a Minn Kota trolling motor, very low power. They've been around since since the 1940s, and they're now quite sophisticated. They have GPS and they're able to keep your boat in one place. But that is only the beginning of where electric boats are at now. There are those motors, but there are all kinds of outboard motors. You can see some of the variety there. We'll get to them. There are inboard motors for both power boats and for sailboats. And there are things called saildrives that are especially made for sailboats, and things called pods, which we don't really have in North America yet, but are quite popular in Europe. And then there are some other kinds of boats. There's a rim motor, which is on the my left of the screen, that one with the pink there. There are some motors that drop in as inboard outboards. There's a kind of do-it-all motor on the right there that can be put into various configurations. And there's a kind of a turbine motor there called deep speed. So essentially, Discover Boating, which is a great site, has all kinds of information about boating. And there is an electric motor for every kind of boat you can name, from a little tin fishing boat right up to great big huge, let's go out on the water for 3 days type boats. Those will be usually hybrid boats, which I'll get to a little bit in the end, but really I'm going to focus on electric boats, all electric. So what you should know is that we are fortunate here in Canada. We have 4 very good electric boat manufacturers. There's Vision Marine Technologies in Montreal. There is in BC Templar Electric, which is in Kelowna. In Montreal again, there's Bow Lake. And it's not a boat company, it is a personal watercraft company, but Taiga Motors is in Montreal. So we are starting to develop an electric boat manufacturing industry here in Canada, which is a great thing to see. So what people want to know usually is an electric boat right for you? And I say that there's kind of 3 ways to think of it. I call it the 3 E's. So first E is enjoyment. The second E is environment, and the third E is expense. And those are kind of the 3 things that most people want to consider when they're thinking about an electric boat. So enjoyment, first, the thing that everyone says when they first get in an electric boat is they go, wow, I cannot believe how quiet it is. For instance, Nautique wakeboarding boats, they just came out with an electric boat last year, and they had a famous wakeboarder world champion out on it. He said, this is the first time I've been in a boat in all my life where I can actually talk to the person driving the boat rather than yelling and screaming. So the silence is quite remarkable. The other thing that's in terms of enjoyment is there's no fumes, so there's no noise. There's no of those noxious fumes coming at you. I know as being a fisherman, I hate being at the back of the boat running the motor and it's all coming back up in your face for hours on end. But the thing you also need to consider about enjoyment is, what do you enjoy about a boat? There are lots of people that love the idea of just getting out for a quiet day on the water. There are other people that think a boat isn't a boat unless it's going absolutely as fast as it can. And the idea of where you're going to use it. Are you going to use it on the ocean? Are you going to use it in an inland lake or a canal? Those are important. And the speed and the range aspects of what I'm talking about there. If you love speed or you're not concerned about speed, how long you want to go for, those are all things to consider. The environment, obviously, is an important thing to consider, and why many people, or more people every day, are getting interested in electric boats. No carbon dioxide emissions, no toxic fumes, as I was talking about before. People ask about batteries in the environment, and there is certainly concern about lithium and cobalt. Especially in cobalt, not so much in regard to environment, but in terms of where they are mined and the human aspect of that. The battery companies are very aware of that and doing all the things that they can to get that better and better every day. There's a lot of move towards having the cobalt and other metals and rare earth elements come from Canada and places like that we're not having human rights problems. The other thing about batteries is there's the sourcing of them, which I've just mentioned. There's also increasingly recyclable. Batteries are being recycled. So for instance, BMW, which is a car company, but also makes batteries for an electric boat motor company called Torqeedo. BMW has taken the batteries from their electric cars that they're not able to maintain enough charge that people want them in their car, but they're fantastic for actually running part of the BMW factory in Germany. They can be charged to levels, they've got 100 or 200 of them in there. So they are recycled. So people that are worried about what happens to batteries after they are used, they are being recycled, and there are more and more programs. There's a Canadian company called Li-Cycle, I believe, that has a radical and very promising technology for recycling batteries. And there's also, even now, the recycling of batteries in that some people that are buying electric boats or electric boat motors are buying used Tesla batteries or EV batteries for their electric boats. One other aspect of the environment, people talk about carbon dioxide. This is from the U.S. National Center for Biotechnology Information. This is a list of all the other stuff that comes out of the exhaust of a fossil fuel motor. It's pretty incredible. So it's not just carbon, it's all of this stuff that comes out from fossil fuels. Then, of course, what everyone really, really is interested in is the expense. So in terms of that, like anything else, there's the initial expense, and then there's the ongoing expense. So sorry, I flipped ahead a bit too quickly there. The initial expense, I think you need to think of one of the big expense is the batteries. And the way to think about that is it's like you're buying gas for the next 10 years. So that's what I see. There's that initial expense, which is significant with an electric boat, an electric boat motor, but is, amortized over 10 years or so. I mean, batteries, many batteries can go more than 10 years without a problem, especially for something like a boat where they're not used all the time. And then an electric boat motor has very little ongoing maintenance expenses. There's no oil filters to put in. There's nothing like that. They don't have to be particularly winterized. They are almost, some manufacturers claim zero maintenance. They're not zero maintenance, but just about zero maintenance. So initially expensive, ongoing, not expensive. And of course, the price of electricity is now, and I think for a long time, going to be less than the price of fossil fuels. So which is most important for you? I can't answer that for you. Is it enjoyment, environment, expense? For me, it's probably environment, but everyone has their own way of balancing these things. So in order to understand electric boats and electric boat motors, I've find the best way to do it is to relate it to the common things that you're used to in a fossil fuel boat. And so, there's the motor. All boats need to have a motor, or power boats. Energy source, the drivetrain. There's the energy control. There's the connections, and there is the energy replenishment. So I'll go through those all one at a time. I'm not going to spend too much time on a couple of them. You'll see why. Let's go to the motor first. So an internal combustion engine is, we've all seen them. And there's an electric motor, and we've seen those, but usually not in a boat. Then the energy source for a fossil fuel is obviously gasoline or diesel. And it's a battery for an electric boat. The drivetrain, there are straight drive trains, and this is for both kinds of boats. There's what I call one gear or L-shaped drive trains, and then two gear like Z drive, or some people call them S drive, kind of the inboard outboard type arrangement where the power goes horizontal, then vertical, then horizontal again. The energy control in a fossil fuel boat, there's the carburetor in older ones and fuel injection in newer and more sophisticated ones. In an electric boat, the thing that corresponds with that is a controller. And that controls how much electricity comes out of the battery and where it comes from, or where it comes out of the battery and at what rate. in terms of how you actually control that, they're basically the same. There's a throttle. So driving an electric boat, the actual thing in your hand is exactly the same as in a fossil fuel boat. Then there's the connections, hoses and clamps and things for fossil fuel, and only cables for electric. And then there's energy replenishment. So for fossil fuel, we go to a fuel station, either in the marina, or some people can take the gas from a gas station or diesel. For an electric boat, there's shore chargers. You can charge them from your home outlet. You can charge them with solar, you can charge them with wind, and you can charge them with something called hydro generation, which we will get to in a bit. So lots of options there. And in terms of the chargers, there's kind of regular charges, just like EVs, that do it slowly from your regular outlet at home, and then fast chargers that have higher voltage. So we're going to go through them. The energy control and connections, I'm not going to dwell on because, it's just cables and clamps. But it's important to understand the difference in how the motors work, because that is really at the core of the whole difference. So an internal combustion motor, we have gasoline, and it goes in one side, and then the piston and the cylinder start moving and suck the gasoline in, push it back up, there's an explosion, that forces the piston down, comes back up, and the exhaust comes out. And that's how it all starts spinning around. And every time, or every second time it goes, that piston goes up, there is an explosion at the top of or at one end of the cylinder. So, you might have 4 cylinders, you could have 8 cylinders, you could have 12 cylinders. They are all exploding and rotating and doing all this literally, thousands of times per minute. So that's the internal combustion motor, gas going in and exhaust coming out. Now, an electric motor is an awful lot simpler. And they all work pretty well the same. They are just based on magnets. And so we all know that if you take similar ends of a magnet and try to put them together, they will repel each other. And if you take the opposite ends of a magnet and stick them together, they will attract each other. So an electric motor works on the premise that you put a bunch of magnets around the outside of another magnet, and it attracts and repels. The outside ones attract and repel the rotor in the middle. It's called the stator, the stationary thing on the outside. Attracts and repels, attracts and repels, attracts and repels. And that is what makes the motor go round and round and round. You get more powerful motors by putting in more energy, or by having stronger magnets, or a variety of ways. And because it's an electric motor, it's not like batteries that you're playing around with as a kid. One part of it needs to be an electromagnet, which is a normal piece of metal that becomes magnetized through electricity. And then both sides can be electromagnets, or one can be a permanent magnet, which is more like what you play around with at home, something that is always magnetic. And they can be direct current DC, they can be alternate current AC, and then there are all kinds of things that the motors can also be induction and 3-phase and brushless and brushed and asynchronous and synchronous. I'm not going to go into all that, partly because I don't understand all of that, partly because the point of it is that they all work essentially the same. Electricity goes in from the battery through the motor and drives the motor. And whether it's a big motor or a small motor, they all work the same. So I'm leaping now to energy replenishment, because that is a big part of the whole thing. So, with a fossil fuel motor, you can go to the gas station, as we said, or you have the options with an electric motor. And to look at that in a bit more detail, fossil fuel replenishment, you have your gas tank or diesel tank in your boat, and you've got your cylinder going around, your motor going around and around and around and exploding all the time. And every time it explodes, it's burning that that gasoline or that fuel and sending out an exhaust. And that is called combustion. It's burning it very quickly, making it explode. So that's a combustion motor, an internal combustion engine. So what that means is you basically run out of the stuff that you are burning and you're turning it into exhaust. So, it's a one-way system. The only way to replenish that is to go literally back to the well and you get your tank filled up again, and then, start putting it back in and get your engine going, and you'll get that fuel to turn into exhaust. You can't turn that exhaust back into fuel. It's just a one-way thing. So with an electric motor, it's sometimes difficult for people to understand, because we're so used to this idea of something's full and then something's empty and then something's full and then something's empty. But that's not really what happens with a battery. A battery is just a device that stores energy, and the way it works is through something called oxidation and reduction rather than combustion. And so there's two parts of the battery, and on one part of the battery, and I will also say here, for those that are technically inclined, I am simplifying this, and it is not supposed to be exact. It is supposed to be demonstrative. But in essence, on one side of the battery, there is a chemical that has too many electrons. And on the other side of the battery, there's a chemical that doesn't have enough electrons. It wants to have more to balance itself, and the other side wants to give away electrons. In between them, in a rechargeable battery, there's that orange thing there, which is kind of like a one-way mirror. The electrons can go through one way, they can't go through the other way. So when you flip the switch to run your electric boat, the electrons go through the motor. That's what makes the motor go. And they go through to the other side of the battery. So eventually you've taken all the electrons out of the chemical on one side, and now the chemicals on the other side are all filled up. Now, when you go to reverse that, you plug it in. I may have a wrong slide here. No, I think I'm good. So what happens is when you plug it into the wall, it sends the electrons back through the battery. And so you see through that one-way mirror type thing, they are allowed to go through the battery, and now it's back to where it was before. So that's discharging and charging a battery. So it's not empty and full so much as a circular thing. And I kind of think of it as more that it's changing color, changing chemicals, rather than being empty and full. There's another thing about an electric motor when it comes to replenishment that is important. If you have an electric motor and you're running it, you're out in your boat and runs down, there you go, all the electrons have changed. If you take an electric motor and instead of having it run by electricity, you run it by hand. So somebody turns the motor backwards. What happens is it actually becomes a turbine, just like the turbines that generate electricity, for all of us. And so by turning it by hand, it actually creates electricity. It generates electricity, and that can be used to recharge the battery. So it doesn't need to be a man there. It could be a woman. I'm not trying to be sexist there. It was just a cartoon that I saw. So it can, if you think of it, a turbine, also a wind turbine, we know how those work. They spin around, and they generate electricity. So a boat propeller can do exactly the same thing. So I'll get to that in the next slide. But in terms of energy replenishment, as I said, you can plug in your electric motor, the battery rather, to get it recharged. You could have a solar panel on your boat or at your home or on your dock that could recharge it. You could have a windmill on your boat. There are lots of wind turbines for boats that are used to recharge batteries. And on the right is this thing called hydrogeneration, which is for a sailboat. Maybe you've used your electric motor to tootle around the harbor and dock the boat and things. And now you need to recharge the battery. When you're out sailing and you're under wind power, you can essentially flip a switch so that as you're going through the water, the propeller spins backwards, or it can spin in the same direction and just the polarity of it gets changed. But anyway, in the same way that a wind turbine creates energy, that can recharge your battery. So there's a few motors that can do that. In fact, a company called ePropulsion that we'll get to in a bit, about a month and a half ago, they came out with outboard motors that will hydro regenerate. That is a first. Usually it's been inboard motors that have done that. So that's energy replenishment. And there is another way to replenish the energy in your battery, but I'm not going to talk about it today because we're talking about electric boats, but that is with a diesel generator on your boat. And that's where you get into large boats, 33, 40, 60-foot boats that are going out for a few days. They will have an electric motor, and they will also have a diesel generator to recharge the batteries in case of there's not enough sunshine or whatever. But I'm not going to dwell on that because this is about electric boats. I'm just going to have a drink of water here. So in terms of energy source, we all know that for a fossil fuel boat, it's gasoline or diesel. Excuse me. And so, there's varying degrees. There's marine gasoline, there's different octanes. And as I said, it could be diesel or it could be gasoline. For electric boats, it's a bit more complicated. You need a deep cycle battery. You can't take the battery that starts your car or that starts your boat. You need those deep cycle batteries that are used for trolling motors. What that means is that they charge and discharge deeply, and they can be recharged a lot of times. So there's lead acid deep cycle batteries. There are AGM lead acid deep cycle batteries, and AGM stands for absorbent glass mat. So the chemicals, instead of being in a liquid state, are in a gel state and absorbed in a glass mat. Then there are lithium ion, which we probably know about from EVs. And then there's lithium iron, commonly called LiFePO batteries. They are safer than lithium ion batteries, but they are more expensive and a little bit heavier. And in terms of the safety of a lithium ion battery, so I've been writing plug boats for 2 years. I've come across one kind of accident with a lithium ion battery, and this is from all over the world. And a few years ago, there was a problem with one manufacturer and their lithium ion battery. But I say to people, gasoline's not that safe if you take a match to it. So yes, I mean, it's lithium ion. There are things you need to be aware of, but I wouldn't be concerned about the safety. There are other battery chemistries, too many to go into now, here, and they are in large part being used to take cobalt out of the lithium ion type of battery. And there are some other things like lithium sulfur that are being used because they have higher energy density, which we'll get to in a minute. And so they are being tested on airplanes and things. So there are other chemistries, but these are the main ones. So when you're considering a battery, again, there's 3 E's, but the E's stand for something different. There's the energy density, as I said, we'll get to that. There's the efficiency. And again, there's always the expense. Energy density means how much energy is packed into something. It can be measured by volume, density per liter. It can be measured by weight, density per kilogram. So I'm using energy by weight here. And another way to think of that is watt hours per kilogram. So that's how it's expressed. Energy density is watt hours or kilowatt hours per kilogram. So lead acid batteries have a low energy density. An AGM battery has a higher energy density because the glass mats just work better than the water or the liquid of a lead acid. So they have a higher energy density, but still pretty low. And sort of the flip side of a low energy density is a heavy battery, and vice versa. The flip side of a high energy density is a low battery weight. So on that end is lithium batteries. They have high energy density, and so they pack more punch per kilogram. So lighter weight to do the same thing. So to give you an example, and this will be important later, the energy density of a lead acid is about 50 watt hours per kilogram. And for lithium batteries is about 150 watt hours per kilogram. The efficiency means sort of charge time. Can it be charged quickly, or does it take a long time? How many times can it be charged and discharged? That's the cycles. And the discharge efficiency. So that means can 100% of a battery, you can't really discharge it that completely, but a lead acid battery can't be charged to the same level, low level as a lithium ion battery. So that's the discharge efficiency. And again, you'll see that lead acid is slower, fewer cycles, and lower efficiency in terms of discharge. Lithium, is on the other end, faster, more cycles, and a higher efficiency. So more energy can come out of the battery. And AGM is somewhere in the middle, but more towards the lead acid side. And then the expense, you're going to find this entirely surprising. Lead acid is the cheapest, lithium is the most expensive, and AGM is somewhere in the middle, and again, more towards the lead acid side, simply because the actual materials are not as expensive as they are. Well, partly the materials aren't as expensive. Partly there have been a lot more lead acid batteries made than there have been lithium ion batteries. So there's the economies of scale there. So now going back to that list that we had, there's the drivetrain, which is the same as same as for fossil fuel boats. But there's one particular difference with electric boats. If we go to the straight drivetrain, that is a Torqeedo electric outboard. So it doesn't look like a straight drivetrain. It looks like it's a one-gear L drivetrain, as I said before, but it's not, because the difference is that with this motor, or this engine, the actual motor is in the water. So unlike where a fossil fuel outboard, where you have the power head on top and then gears that transmit the power down to the propeller, and there's another gear that sends it, transmits the power to the horizontal shaft, the motor is actually in the water. And in that shaft, there's nothing but cables. There's a battery on top, there's cables in the middle, and the motor is actually in the water at the bottom. So that's a big difference between fossil fuel and some fossil fuel and some electric outboards. And there are a variety of outboards that are like that. Aquamo is a big name in Europe. Combi, Elva, E-Propulsion, who I mentioned earlier, is big. And the biggest is Torqeedo. Carvin and Krautler are both available here in North America, but pretty rare. So that's that straight drivetrain. There is a limit to how big a motor can be put underneath the water, simply because of the size of the motor and some other aspects, mainly the size. So once you get to a certain size, probably about 10 kilowatts, you have to go to a different outboard. But the pod, that straight drive train is also used in something called a pod, which I alluded to earlier. A pod is basically that the same as that outboard idea with the wires in the middle, but for a sailboat. And so as you can see where there's those two bolts there, that actually bolts into the hull of the sailboat. So the motor sits underneath and then the battery is inside the boat. So that's a pod. Same kind of thing. And there are a number of pods for sailboats. Many of the same manufacturers. E-Tech is there. E-Tech has a place in Maine that sells them. I'm not sure about the West Coast. But those are the pod motors. And in fact, some of the companies like Combi, which is the green one there, essentially the pod motor is exactly the same as their lower power outboards. It's just one has a handle on it and one has some bolts to put it into the boat. So the other straight drivetrain is an inboard where you have an electric motor and a shaft and the propellers on the other end of the shaft. It's pretty straightforward. You can buy those yourself. You can, there are kits that you can put those in your boat. And there is ones where the shafts are already there. So Krautler has one where the shaft is already attached. Ocean Volt has one where it's already attached. And if you look at that motor on the top there, that's actually 3 electric motors that stack together. In the Ocean Volt system, you can have the 110 kilowatt motor, and then add another one. Then you've got a 30 kilowatt motor. Add another one. You've got a 30 kilowatt motor. Sorry, math is not my thing. 10, 20, 30. They can be stacked up. Here are some manufacturers of straight drivetrains. Elco is in the US. Bell Marine is all over the world. They're big. Electroprop is in the US. Fisher Panda is mainly known for generators, but they also make motors. Ocean Volt that I mentioned in Torqeedo. And so in terms of do-it-yourself, here is a list of some places. If you go to plugboats.com, you can see them, a lot of them listed there. HPEVS is a big one. Thunderstruck EV is a really big one. It is used for a lot of people that are doing DIY motorcycles or cars, small cars. And getlithium.com is actually in BC. I'm not sure where, but they have batteries, motors, and everything there. Drivetrain. So the 1-gear L. So here's where we get into those kind of larger electric outboards. So sorry, I'm just looking. I can't remember what I've got on the slide. Oh yeah. So essentially, an electric outboard of this configuration is the same as a fossil fuel outboard. The power head is on the top, goes down. The power goes down the shaft, comes out the propeller after another gear in there. The only difference is it's run by a battery instead of being run by a gas tank. There are a number of those. Bell Marine, Elco. As I say, Elco is in the US. E-Tech, you can probably get them around. Golden Motor is in China, but I think you can find them on the west coast of Canada. Parson, the same thing. Pure Watercraft is actually in Seattle. That's the one on the bottom row, second from the right in the middle there. Stealth is a guy in Texas who basically builds them on demand. He actually uses Yamaha casings and the propeller system and the gears and everything, and essentially just puts an electric power head on the top. And then there is Torqeedo, which they make every kind of electric motor. So you can also have 1-gear L drives in saildrives. And so this is where, if you look at the one on the bottom left there, there's like the flange sits in the bottom of the sail, is attached to the bottom of the sailboat. The motor is inside the sailboat, and only the shaft and the gears are underneath the hull. So that's an example there. And that the one in the on the top right there with the golden propellers, that is the Ocean Volt hydro generation system there. So Bell Marine is big in that. Electric Yacht is in the US. Fisher Panda, Ocean Volt, Pictronic. I know you can get them in North America, and Torqeedo. So Z-Drive, there are a couple of companies that are now starting to make their motors adaptable to Z-Drive. So they say they build them so that you can attach it to a Mercruiser outdrive or to a Volvo Penta outdrive. But they're not very common. So you can see those guys on the left. That one on the blue one is from Sweden, EP Technology, I think. The other motor there, the pink propeller one, is a rim motor. And that is different in that it doesn't have the propeller blades coming from a central shaft. It has them attached to the outer rim, which is why it's called a rim motor. And one of the advantages to that is it has higher efficiency at higher speeds because it doesn't have something called prop loss, which comes about because the outside of a propeller spins at a faster rate than the inside of a propeller. The next one over, that Hydrojet, is a rim motor, but kind of with an expanded channel that the water goes through. And those guys, Deep Speed in Italy, they actually have a Z-Drive. That thing can attach to a Mercruiser or a Volvo Penta. And just yesterday, I wrote in Plug Boats, they are working on a 500 kilowatt electric motor, which is a big high power motor. And then these guys, C-Drive on the right, are from Norway, and that's the one that's kind of adaptable. You can make it an inboard or an outboard or a pod or whatever you'd like. Sorry, my voice is going here. So, but what you really care about is the speed and the range. And what you need to know about that is the kilowatts and the which is kW, so kilowatts and kilowatt per hour. So I'm going to relate this to fossil fuel boats and horsepower. So these motors that I've shown go everywhere from 1 kilowatt to 220 kilowatts, now 500 kilowatts. And the batteries that with them go from 1 kilowatt hour to 196 kilowatt hours as an example. And that one on the right, the 196 kilowatt hour, is actually a Tesla battery pack. So a Tesla battery pack is actually, well, all batteries are basically a bunch of AA batteries glued together. So the Tesla, if you took that apart, it looks like somebody just took a whole bunch of 2-volt mini batteries, stuck them all together, and that's how you get 196 kilowatt worth of storage. But that's basically how batteries work. They're little ones glued together. So now I'm going to equate that to horsepower. A 10 kilowatt motor. Sorry, I lost my place here. I'm going to relate that to range and speed. A 10 kilowatt motor attached to a 10 kilowatt hour battery is basically just a division. So you divide the kilowatt hours by the kilowatts. So in this case, if you take a 10 kilowatt hour battery and a 10 kilowatt motor and you run it flat out, then it will go flat out for 1 hour. 10 kilowatts divided by 10 kilowatt hours divided by 10 kilowatts is 1 hour. If you have a 100 kilowatt hour battery and a 10 kilowatt motor and you run it full out, it will go for 10 hours. I think that's what it says there. Can't see that part of my screen. And I would say here that in addition to those batteries being a bunch of little ones glued together, you can also take smaller batteries and string them together. So you can take, four 48 volt batteries or 2 48 volt batteries and make them into another battery that can give you extended kilowatt hours. I won't get into it too much, but if you string the batteries together one way, you get more power. If you string the batteries together another way, you get longer a longer range, more kilowatt hours. So I'm talking about kilowatts here, and you don't know exactly what it is, so I'm going to relate it to a horsepower. A kilowatt is bigger than a horsepower. A kilowatt and a horsepower, they're both just measurements of power, how much work something can do. So a kilowatt is 1.3 horsepower, 1 1/3 horsepower, or think of it another way, a horsepower is 3/4 of a kilowatt. So here is kind of a list of how that compares. You know, a 5 horsepower mode is a 1 to 3 kilowatt, and on up the line. But the important thing to think about is that the number is just a number. So they are just different measurements of the same thing. So if you have a boat with a 15 horsepower motor, and you drop in a 12 kilowatt electric motor, it's going to be exactly the same. It's going to go at the same speed. All the things will be identical. It's just a different measure, different way of referring to the power. So obviously the difference though is one runs on batteries and one runs on gas. So this is where you get the key difference between fossil fuel and electric motors. We talked about the energy density of a lithium ion battery being 150 watt hours per kilogram and being much bigger than a lead acid. So to compare that to gasoline, gasoline is 13,000 watt hours per kilogram. So it is 85 times as much, has 85 times as much energy density. So yeah, in kilowatts, don't make the mistake I make sometimes. Kilowatts are 1,000 watts and kilowatt hours are 1,000 watt hours. So a lithium ion battery has 1.15 kilowatt hours per kilogram, and gasoline has 13 kilowatt hours per kilogram. So that seems like it's a terrible, terrible difference, but it depends, as I said, how you use your boat. If you want to go out and go full tilt all the time for 2 hours, you're going to have difficulty with an electric boat. If you want to go out and to your favorite fishing spot and get there quickly and then hang around for an hour and then get back at, quickly or a half speed, then you're good. So
Jeff,
let's
we have
take...
we have less than 15 minutes left.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bobby. I thought we had less than 5, so I was kind of rushing along. Here we'll go. So let's compare them a bit. So if you had a 6 kilowatt hour battery and a 10 kilowatt motor, so call that like 13 to 15 horsepower motor, you do that division. So at flat out, you could go for 0.6 hours. So you could go 36 minutes flat out. You could go for 1 hour and 12 minutes at half speed, and 3 hours going at trolling speed with that 6 kilowatt hour battery. Then this is an actual boat that has a 100 kilowatt hour battery in it, and it's a 120 kilowatt boat. It goes pretty good. So that one, you do the division again. So flat out, it can go for 50 minutes. At half speed, it can go for 1 1/5 hours, an hour and whatever that is, 20 minutes or 12 minutes, I guess, and 3 hours of slow moving. And so for a sailboat with a sail pod there, you're not really concerned about speeding around. You're usually using the battery or the electric motor just to get around the harbor and things. So you might have an 8 kilowatt hour battery, 2 kilowatt motor, and really, you can have 9 hours of slow moving, doing whatever you like. If you need to, the wind's down and you need to get to port, you'll be just fine. So now we get to that original question. Is an electric boat right for you? Well, that of course is what you need to answer. But I hope that gives you an idea of those 3 E's, the enjoyment, there's the silence, which lots of people enjoy. No fumes, which I really, really enjoy. And that's for me and for the environment. And then there's that usage location that we were talking about. And that's why I gave you those examples of the the run times of motors, of electric boats and motors and things. So it depends what you want to do. You know, for fishing and going trolling, it's fantastic. If you need to go really, really fast for a really long time, you're going to need a really, really big battery that's going to weigh a lot. But most people, you know, have some kind of variety in what they want to do with their boats. There's that speed range equation that you need to think about. And as I said, you know, whatever kind of boat you want, there is an electric motor for that. But, you know, it gets to those things that I talked about. And what it really gets to is the expense. But, you know, for power boats, you've got all kinds of options, inboard, outboard, you know, in whatever. For sailing, you've got all kinds of options if you're a sailor and you want something to get you around the harbor. So yeah, let's get to the expense. This is the part that everyone likes to say, yeah, but what about? So what I've done is I have given examples. I've only used outboard motors because otherwise what happens is there is just too many variables involved. It just gets too complicated. So what I have done is compared the initial expense and the ongoing expense, maintenance being part of that. So here I've taken an Elco 9.9 7 kilowatt motor, and I'm comparing that to a Yamaha 9.9. And so if you look at the prices of just the motor, the Elco is $3,700. Sorry, I can't see the right of the screen, so I think the Yamaha is going to come in. Oh, sorry, $3,210. The battery for the Elco runs from $2,700 to $6,100. These are all in Canadian amounts, even though Elco is in the US. So the by battery, etc., I mean the battery, the controller, the charger, the cables, all the stuff that you need to get your boat to run. So that runs from $2,700 to $6,100. And the $2,700 option is the AGM, the absorbent glass matte lead acid battery. And the $6,100 is the lithium ion battery, which needs different chargers and things. So that's the range there. So for gas, I have said for 10 years, I've said 300 liters a year. And I've said this year it's $1.50 for per liter for marine gas. I don't know what it will be, and I definitely don't know what it will be in 10 years, but that's what I've put there. And so that's $5,000. And maintenance is pretty well zero for the Elco, and maintenance for the Yamaha, I've put in $1,000 over 10 years, $100 a year between, you know, putting in oil and putting in oil filters and whatever else goes wrong with boat motors. So the range there is $6,400 to $9,800, and the Yamaha is $9,200, you know, over a 10-year period. So that's, you know, that looks good. When you get to the bigger batteries at this point, the difference gets larger. So an Elco 50, which is a 35 kilowatt motor, we'll compare that to a Yamaha F60 because they don't make a 50 horsepower motor. So there you've got the motors are pretty well the same, 11,500 versus 11,700. Now the battery though is the big difference. So the battery is $22,000. The reason that the battery is $22,000 is that there is no AGM option currently, or there's no AGM option for a motor of that size. It would just be too much weight to be able to run that motor for any length of time. So there's only a lithium ion option for that boat at this time. With some of those new chemistries and perhaps solid state batteries, there will be other options, but that's where we are now. So the gas for 10 years on the Yamaha, I've put in twice as much just because it's a bigger motor. So that's $10,000. And for maintenance, there may be some maintenance on the Elco. So I've just put in something there, but it won't be a lot. And $3,000 for the Yamaha over the course of 10 years. So there you get those differences. So 34,000 versus 24,000, 24/7, almost 25. So you can see that the big difference there when you move up is in the batteries. Having said that, this is over 10 years, and I'm confident saying this because I know that you won't be able to find me. Batteries there are many EV batteries that have run for 7 and 8 years that are still perfectly serviceable. So a 10-hour battery life is probably at the lower end of things, although some people have had problems with batteries, but I would say at the lower end of things. But I'm not trying to sell you totally on an electric boat here. I'm trying to give you a realistic idea of the costs and things. So that gives you some idea of the costs. The environment, we've spoken about that. No CO2 emissions, no toxic fumes, that list of things that we saw. The batteries are getting solved in terms of the human impact in some of the countries where cobalt and lithium are mined. And recycling is happening. And this is good because Bobby's coming on and I am coming to the end and saying, you need to weigh which of those things are the most important. And that's how you can get a hold of me. And if there are any questions, I will answer as many as I can with the time remaining.
All right. We have Thomas Casey asking, do you know whether it is complicated to have one of the European e-boats like Rand delivered to the USA and serviced if necessary?
The European boat?
E-boat.
Sorry, I don't know that brand name. I don't know that much about importing boats to the U.S. I don't know whether there are protection for U.S. boats. I wouldn't think so because there are all kinds of sailboats and everything that are made in Europe that come into the U.S. In terms of maintenance of the electric side of it, there's not really anything particularly crazy about these electric motors. They are electric motors that have been largely adapted for marine use. So, if something does go wrong, you should be able to get them fixed. And in terms of the linkage to the drivetrain, I mean, that's pretty well the same as if you put in if you put in a fossil fuel motor and linked it up to your drivetrain. It's, essentially the same with electric motor. You might need some adapters and things, but that's about how it works.
Okay, we have Paul Reitzner asking, what about using a fuel cell in place of an FF generator?
That is definitely possible, and I have purposely, Paul, not gone into all of the options. The e-propulsion guys that I talked about, they have a system with EFOY, which I see is which is an exhibitor at the Vancouver Boat Show. EFOY makes methane fuel cells, and they have worked with e-propulsion to get them to power the e-propulsion boats. For the others out there, a fuel cell is just another way of storing electrical energy. And so what happens is the fuel cell turns hydrogen or methane or whatever is in there into electricity and heat and water. So it can also run an electric boat. An electric boat just needs electricity coming into it. Doesn't matter where it comes from. So sorry, I didn't go into hydrogen fuel cells just because it makes things complicated. I hope that answers your question. If not, email me and I'll look into it a bit more for you.
All right, we have Paul asking, can you power a motor directly using a fuel cell so you do not need a huge array of batteries?
So that's part of that same answer. It would depend on you. I don't know enough about it. I think you might need some kind of adapter, but there's certainly fuel cells are on the radar of all of the electric boat manufacturers. So Yeah, email me on that if that's Paul or someone else, and I will definitely dig into that for you and get you a full and complete answer.
Okay, now we have Paul asking a three-part question.
Uh-oh.
Do people use AC motors for sailboats? Are permanent magnet motors more efficient? Does it use less power?
Right. So that's where I'm going to say I am not not a mechanical engineer. And I will say that, yes, people use AC and DC motors on all kinds of boats. Obviously, you need an inverter if you are going to run a DC motor, because you don't have, if you an AC motor, you need an inverter to change the direct current into alternating current. But there are definitely motors of all types, and I wouldn't even begin to say one is better than the other, because it depends what it is being used for. So you really need to go to the manufacturer's site and dig into it and find out what you need done and what are the advantages and the disadvantages. But yeah, AC and DC both are used on boats.
All right, and that brings us to the end of the seminar. I'm sure there's a lot more questions. Please take note of Jeff's contact information, which is currently displayed on the screen. And at this point, I'd like to thank Jeff Butler for this presentation. It's been great to have you here. Thank you, everybody else who joined as well. And I hope you have a great day at the boat show.
Thank you very much. Email me if you need to know anything.
Oh yeah, the season starts.